So this is an amazing time for the field of clinical trials. I think clinical trials are the world's most expensive experiments in some ways, right? That's why it costs so much to develop devices and drugs. Yet we're in this mode where half of our trials fail, and when trials fail, we don't even really publish papers about them or even share raw data. And I think this is going to change. I think it's starting with the journals requiring more data sharing, more transparency. It's then reaching the funding agencies like NIH and others that require data to be released and shared. And then it's coming to government regulation, requiring more sharing of data. Look at the EMEA, the Institute of Medicine and FDA are requiring this soon. So I think this is a very dynamic time for our clinical trials. When people think about clinical trials, they're really looking at the future in terms of how clinical trials are not going to really be designed for all comers with a particular disease. We're heading towards more and more subsets or precision subsets, what this field of precision medicine is. And key to defining precision medicine are measurements on patients, whether it's measurements from their wearables and outcomes, all the way down to their molecules. And when you have a lot of measurements, you end up with a lot of data. And that's where big data really plays a role in the future of clinical trials. Not just the data we get to collect during trials, but once that data is released to the public, that itself becomes another source of trials data that nobody's really looking at today. So I really see clinical trials now changing in the genome era. We're certainly talking about precision medicine today. We're talking about because President Obama really even talks about precision medicine in a State of the Union address. What is precision medicine? Well, it's really beyond just individualized dosing of patients. We've been dosing patients specifically going back to insulin 100 years ago. But now we're really thinking about exact molecular subsets of cancers, of disorders. You might not just have diabetes, but what kind of diabetes? Not just malignant melanoma, but do you have the right DNA mutation that lets you go for a particular drug? Now the challenge though for the clinical trials industry though is that we have this kind of catch-22. Do we figure out the subsets first and then the drug, or the drug and then figure out its subsets? And that's a challenge, what we're all trying to solve right now. So I think the next big world for us in the clinical trial space is the release of public data. Of course, we've been sharing DNA sequences on repositories like GenBank and the molecular measurements like mass spec and microarrays. But now I'm talking about the release of trials data. And I don't even mean that summary stuff you got to put on clinicaltrials.gov. I mean all the raw tables from a trial being released to the public. What does that mean? Imagine the future where the public comes and asks you, why do you think this trial really failed? Or why do you think this trial really succeeded? They're going to have their eyes on the data just like you have had your eyes as a clinical trials researcher. And what that really means, though, is even for trials that fail, there might be a third-party researcher. It might be a kid in high school that realizes maybe the drug is working in a subset of patients. And they find a molecular marker that defines where it's working. They test it in another trial data set. So I think neutral third parties who are not part of the trial are going to innovate using our trials data, and that will be a good thing for the field. So of course I'm high on this idea. So one challenge to releasing data is obviously clinical trials data really belongs in the hands of the sponsors. And those sponsors use contract research organizations, CROs, to gather that data. In many ways, the sponsors own that data. That's clear cut. But and there's also going to be resistance, obvious resistance from the sponsors to releasing data. More eyes are not going to make people more comfortable here, right? But the mandates to share are not going to come from that community. It's going to come from the public. It's going to come from the governments. It's going to come from the regulatories. Because there's at least some distrust in this system now. There's more demand for transparency and reproducibility. Those are the mandates that are leading to data sharing. Whether the industry likes it or not, the mandates are there. What I'm trying to say, though, is instead of focusing on that negative, focus on the positive. Imagine this world now where all the trials data is public. What would you do with that data? And create that solution now, because we know we're heading that way. So one can put up all the barriers and try to fight this, or try to figure out what you would do with that trials data once it's released.